In order to give you a very broad overview of what European energy regulation is about, we will have to have a look at the core provisions in the European treaties dealing with energy policy, as well as have a short glance at some of the secondary law provisions that have a particularly relevant impact on institutional questions of European energy regulation. But we also have to have a look at some core features of European Union law in general in order to understand how European Union law is working and how it is being transposed to national law, to the national laws of the member states. We will first of all start with an overview of what European energy policy is about and what the core sources of European energy law are, and then go on until we come to the more specific questions of how energy regulation in Europe is being done. When one looks at energy law in Europe, one is faced with the core aim of having a transition of energy supply systems away from fossil fuels towards renewable energies, trying to make Europe a carbon neutral energy producing area has been the objective of European energy policy for quite some time now. Therefore, in order to understand how European energy law is working, one has to understand first what the political objectives are and what the core sources of law are that are governing European energy policy. First of all, and that has become more and more important in the last years, one could even say decades, international law on climate change has become particularly relevant for European energy policy. Europe is very much committed to reaching carbon neutrality by 2050 and therefore is trying to modify its current energy system in order to reach that aim. That means phasing out fossil fuel production, and that means building up capacities for renewable energy production and increasing energy efficiency in Europe in general. That means that the international law on climate change, we will deal with that in a second, has become more and more relevant for European energy law. And hence, European energy policy is very much driven by the global aims that are related to combating climate change. However, environmental issues as protecting the climate are not the only features that have been determining European energy policy during the last decades. On the contrary, European Union energy law started off as a single market project. It started off as a specific single market for energy, for electricity and for gas in the second half of the 1990s. So the first and foremost objective at this time was to reunite, or not reunite perhaps, but rather unite the different systems, harmonize the different supply systems and legal systems in European energy law in the different member states of the European Union, so that one would reach the aim of having a single market of energy in the European Union. And that means not only aligning legislation, but also creating institutions that are helping this overall objectives of getting a single market. Up until then, European energy markets were quite separated from one another. energy law was a competence of the member states, obviously, and the member states have had at the time quite different sets of energy supply systems. Therefore, the single market project concerning energy was the first and foremost objective of energy regulation in Europe in the beginning of what we can call now a common European energy policy. Nowadays, environmental issues have become more and more important, as I told you already, concerning climate protection in particular. And the relationship between the single market objective and the environmental protection objective has not always been a very smooth one. Since single market issues often tend to be, let's say, not particularly compatible with environmental protection issues that are not really interested in market solutions. So therefore, reconciling the conflicts between the requirements of environmental protection in the energy sector and single market issues on the other side has been one of the defining features of European energy policy recently. And there is a last point that I would like to make, which has become more and more important as well. Energy security. Energy security deals with questions of supply security. That means that enough energy is available. Deals with questions of grid stability, that the networks are sufficiently stable in order to provide energy all the time, at every single second, and therefore energy security is something which, well, has to do something with energy, with the single market on energy, but also has to do something with environmental protection. And here again we see some sort of conflicts that European Union law has been trying to reconcile in the past and is trying to reconcile still. Since if we are talking about energy supply being sufficient, then we have to take into account that some sources are more reliable than other sources, and that in particularly renewable energies, although they are available in huge quantities, are not particularly reliable and well manageable, because the sun doesn't shine every day and wind is not always available. So therefore, renewable energies have some problems in terms of energy supply security. On the other hand, fossil fuels are extremely stable and reliable. However, they've got problems with environmental protection issues, with climate protection issues. Therefore, one had to find a sort of reconciliation between the two requirements and to make renewable energies more stable, more reliable, and to create an environment, to create a regulatory environment that is making sure that energy supply security is still there and is still guaranteed, even when we are talking about combating climate change and renewable energy. And that brings the single market into play, because the single market is enhancing reliability. If you've got a huge grid, a very well connected grid, then reliability is better served than if you've got lots of small grids that might be unstable, and when they are unstable, they can even fail. If you've got a large grid which is well connected, then the danger of blackouts is being significantly reduced. Therefore, creating the single market on energy is helping the energy security objective as well. So therefore, we see here a quite intricate a pattern of conflict and of conciliation requirements between the different objectives that European energy policy is trying to address. When we want to have a look at the sources that define European energy law at the moment, we first of all have to have a look at international law. Because the European Union is a member of several treaties concerning climate protection, and I've set out the most relevant treaties in this field here. The core treaties, one could say, which is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Then we've got the Kyoto Protocol, which used to be important until 2012, and then we've got the Paris Agreement from 2016 onwards, signed in 2015 and entered into force in 2016. In these treaties, the members, the parties to the treaties, undertake the obligation to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, at least if we are talking about industrialized countries, as the European countries are, and to meet some specific objectives, some specific goals in order to protect the climate, in order to combat climate change. And the Paris Agreement in particular is now shaping the European energy policy. Why is that the case? Well, it's quite simple. Because energy supply, energy production is one of the most important sources of greenhouse gas emissions. And therefore, if you want to cut your greenhouse gas emissions, you certainly have to do something with your energy supply. And therefore, the European Union, if the European Union wants to reach, and it has undertaken the obligation to reduce their greenhouse gas emission until 2015 with a view to reach climate neutrality, then you have to do something about your energy supply system. Therefore, the Paris Agreement with its obligations on the member states to do something about climate change. I don't go into detail here because are not talking about climate change law in this podcast. If you take the Paris Agreement seriously, then you have to align your energy supply systems to the requirements of what the European Union has set as its objective, as its nationally determined contribution, as the Paris Agreement calls it, to reach climate neutrality, to reach carbon neutrality in 2050. One has to add that under European Union law, international treaties have binding force not only in the relationship with the other countries, but also internally. According to the European constitutional system, and I'm talking about the European Union here, not about the different member states where things can be a little bit different, but as far as the European Union is concerned, if the European Union concludes a treaty, an international treaty, then this treaty enters into force. The European Union is bound by this treaty, and every institution of the European Union, including the legislature, has to abide by this international treaty. That is a requirement of the European treaties. That is a requirement of European constitutional law. So the European institutions couldn't just say, well, we've got this international treaty, but we are not abiding by it. That wouldn't be possible. It would not be legally feasible under European Union law. This slide just gives you the sources of the international treaties that I've talked about very briefly. You can read the texts here and study them in more detail. I already said in the beginning that European energy law and policy is a multidimensional project. I talked about this old market objective, which is still valid because it's important, especially for security issues, but it's also important for climate protection, because in a single market you can normally work more efficiently and therefore you can reach your aims at a lower cost. That's at least the theory. Then we've got the security issue, the energy security, energy supply security that I talked about, and which is another core objective in European energy policy, an objective that has become more and let's say, politically problematic, the more and more unstable the entire world has become, because energy supply relies heavily on supply chains, and if supply chains do not work properly, then you've got a problem with energy supply security. Then we've got the climate protection issue. I talked about that already. Climate protection has become more and more important in recent years because the requirements of international law have become more and more strict. And if the European Union wishes to reach climate neutrality in 2050, there is still quite a long way to go. And finally, we've got consumer protection. That's another issue which I haven't mentioned yet, but which is relevant as well. Obviously, consumer protection is closely linked to security, because if you haven't got any security of supply, then the consumers are in a rather bad position. Obviously, the market serves consumers well, or is meant to serve consumers well, because of its efficiency gains and consumers being able to buy energy at lower costs than before that. However, there is another issue that has to be taken into account, and that is the overall question of affordability. If energy is not affordable, it doesn't really help at all if it is climate neutral or if it's particularly stable and secure. If people can't afford it, then energy supply is not serving its objectives, and therefore consumer protection, and especially this question, this topic of affordability, has to be taken into account as well. All these issues resonate in Article 194 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. This provision is the core provision on energy policy of the EU, and it contains the core objectives, and it obtains the competence for the European Union to act, to legislate in this field. First of all, the objectives. I will quote this article here and highlight some specific features. In the context of the establishment and functioning of the internal market, here we've got the market issue. And with regard for the need to preserve and improve the environment, here we've got the overall environmental protection objective. Union policy on energy shall aim in a spirit of solidarity between member states. Well, I'll leave that apart, because that's extremely difficult, extremely unclear what the text means here, and it doesn't really concerns us here in this class on European energy regulation. As I said, Union policy on energy shall aim to ensure the functioning of the energy market. Here, again, market objective. Ensure security of energy supply in the Union. The second objective that I already talked to you about. Promote energy efficiency and energy saving, the development of new and renewable forms of energy. Now that has to do something, or that is aiming at climate protection quite clearly. And finally, promote the interconnection of energy networks. That is another market issue, but more on the infrastructure side. As I told you, European energy markets were very fragmented before the Union started to harmonize the energy systems. And therefore, these fragmented markets didn't really have any working interconnections, or at least not as many as you need to have if you want to create a single market. And therefore, on the infrastructure side, the European Union is also competent to promote the interconnection of networks, of grids, to create some sort of trans-European networks in order to make the market function better, and in order to improve energy supply. Because obviously, if you've got a a better connected European grid, then energy supply questions in one country may not be as problematic as if you do not have these interconnections between the countries, if basically everyone is on its own. In order to reach these objectives, I said already, the European Union is entitled to legislate. And that's what paragraph 2 says. Without prejudice to the application of other provisions of the treaties, the European Parliament and the Council, acting in accordance with the ordinary legislative procedure. I'm not going into detail here, but it's relevant. The legislators in the European Union, which is the European Parliament and the Council, are entitled to legislate in this field. They are entitled to establish the measures necessary to achieve the objectives in paragraph 1. Such measures shall be adopted after consultation of some other institutions I'm not going to talk to you about here. However, there is one exception, and this exception is quite problematic in political terms, but also problematic in legal terms. Such measures, that's sub-paragraph 2, such measures shall not affect a member state's right to determine the conditions for exploiting its energy resources, its choice between different energy sources, and the general structure of its energy supply without prejudice to another article. Now, what does that mean? That means basically that although the European Union is entitled to create a single market of energy in Europe, and although the European Union is entitled to enact climate protection measures, and measures guaranteeing energy security, the European Union is not entitled to tell member states how to use and which energy sources they are entitled to use. Therefore, this energy mix, this mix of different energy sources, can be determined by every single member state on its own, which means that the European Union has a rather hard time in imposing reduction targets, greenhouse gas emission reduction targets on individual member states. Because Article 149, paragraph 2, 194, paragraph 2, subparagraph 2 says that the member states can decide quite freely whether or not they wish to continue using fossil fuels. That is the freedom of choice between different energy sources. Now that has something to do with the member states' fear when they were concluding the European treaties, that energy supply security might not be guaranteed if they give up this competence of deciding on which energy source they want to rely on. And it's reflecting also the diversity of energy resources, energy sources in Europe. We've got fossil fuels. Some countries relying more heavily on fossil fuels than others. We've got countries that are relying heavily on renewables. We've got countries relying heavily on nuclear energy. Other countries relying heavily on specific forms of renewable energies like hydroelectric energy, which is not available in other countries because of the geographical conditions. So it's a very diverse set of energy sources in Europe, and that's reflected by Article 194, paragraph 2, subparagraph 2. There are ways to overcome this complexity, this complex task. However, that is an extremely difficult task, and it is something which is politically highly controversial. I'm not going into detail here, and because it's not strictly speaking to do something with our main topic of energy regulation, but one has to keep in mind that the competence in the field of energy policy is a concurring policy, a concurring competence between, on the one hand, the Union, that is able to enact laws in specific fields, and on the other hand, the member states that still have a say in the field of energy mix, energy supply, structure of energy supply. When we are talking about energy regulation, one has to have a look first at the single market objective. It has been an EU target for more than 20 years. I told you it started off in the second half of the 1990s, so it's nearly 30 years now. What is the idea behind that? Well, we have to distinguish between two sources of European Union law, which is first primary law and secondly secondary law. Primary law is the law that is in the treaties of the European Union, in the Treaty on the European Union and the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. So the law that has been created by the member states themselves in concluding these treaties. And in this primary law, in these European treaties, we have got the objective, the overall objective, to create a single market with market freedoms, with a rather restrictive state aid law, with provisions on protection of competition, protection of competition, and so on. On the lower level, we've got secondary legislation, because the primary law, the treaties, and that is quite unusual in international law, the treaties of the European Union enable the European institutions like the European Council, like the Council of the European Union and the European Parliament, to enact laws that are directly binding on all the member states. And in this so-called secondary legislation, because it's on the lower level, secondary legislation, the European legislator is designing the market for electricity, the markets for electricity and gas, and by doing so is relying on heavily regulated markets, is enacting legislation concerning the regulation of these markets. Here you've got the overall provision in the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, which is dealing with the common market. The Union shall adopt measures with the aim of establishing or ensuring the functioning of the internal market in accordance with the relevant provisions of the treaties. The internal market shall comprise an area without internal frontiers in which the free movement of goods, persons, services and capital is ensured in accordance with the provisions of the treaties. Now, that is also relating to energy markets. It's not specifically talking about energy markets, but it's the overall provision, let's say the general provision that is dealing with the market objective. And if you want to go into more detail, you have to look in Article 194, paragraph 1, where this market objective is detailed out for the European energy policy. Just to give you a very broad idea, to give you a very short, brief overview of lawmaking in the European Union. I said already that it is quite unusual in international law that institutions of an international organization, which the European Union is, are entitled to enact laws, which are laws and regulations which are directly binding on the member states, on the state parties to the treaty. And that is stated in Article 5 of the Treaty on the European Union. It says the limits of union competences are governed by the principle of conferral. The use of union competences is governed by the principles of subsidiarity and proportionality. Under the principle of conferral, the Union shall act only within the limits of the competences conferred upon it by the member states in the treaties to attain the objectives set out therein. Competences not conferred upon the Union in the treaties remain with the member states. Now that is the principle of conferral, which is one of the core characteristics of European Union law. However, in the field of energy law, a lot of competence has been conferred up on the European Union. We have seen that in Article 194. So this Article 5 provision is relevant, obviously, as a general provision on lawmaking in the European Union, but the European Union does have power in the field of energy policy to enact laws, irrespective of whether the member states feel that this is a good idea at a given point. The only exception being this provision on energy mix and the structure of energy supply systems, where the member states retain a competence, but a competence which is not, well, let's say, unsurmountable. So there are other provisions, but I'm not going into detail here, that allows the European Union to well, come to grips with the problem that the energy of the member states is so different. Most of these items we've already discussed, at least briefly. The last thing I would like to tell you is this letter D, instruments for rule-making by the European Union. That is a little bit intricate because we are not dealing with real, let's say, acts of parliament here, but with specific instruments that, however, are equally binding and equally compulsory for the member states. If you have a look at Article 288 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, you can see the different instruments that the European institutions have at their disposal in order to enact legally binding rules for all the member states. And in particular, I would like to highlight two of them, which is first the regulation and secondly the directive. The regulation, that is paragraph 2 of Article 288, a regulation shall have general application. It shall be binding in its entirety and directly applicable in all member states. Article 288, paragraph 3, a directive shall be binding as to a result to be achieved upon each member state to which it is addressed, but shall leave to the national authorities the choice of form and methods. So these two are the basic lawmaking instruments for the European institutions. And if I'm talking about European institutions, I mean here the European legislator, which is normally the Parliament and the Council of the European Union. A regulation, therefore, is something which is quite comparable to a national law because it is binding in its entirety and is directly applicable in all the member states. That means the member states do not have any choice whether to follow or not follow this regulation. They have to abide by it. It becomes automatically part of national law when it is enacted and enters into force. The directive is a little bit different. The directive is a legal act that normally needs transposition. That means if the directive leaves open the choice of how to achieve the result that it is stating and that it is fixing with binding force, then the member states still have to enact laws in order to transpose this directive into national law. However, many directives nowadays are so very precise in their wording and are so extremely complicated already that member states often do not have that much leverage in terms of choice how to transpose it. So they normally just copy it, basically. So the distinction between regulation and directive is still there. It is still in the treaties, but in practice there might be a difference, a distinction which is not that big anymore. However, those are the law-making tools that the Union has, and in order to understand where we are going now, I wanted to present them to you very briefly. Two features have to be mentioned which are connected to European Union law, and if you ask yourselves why are the member states doing all that, do they have to do that? The answer is yes, they have concluded the European treaties, that they have promised to abide by them, and European has two specific features which makes it particularly powerful in relation to national law. And that is, first of all, the principle of supremacy, which means that every Union Act, every law that has been enacted by the European Union, that is the Council and European Parliament, is supreme, is higher in the hierarchy compared to national laws, and that applies even to national constitutional law. That means European Union law is the highest law of the land, at least if one accepts this specific feature of European Union law in its entirety. And I don't want to go into the constitutional issues here, the constitutional law problems here, but in general, European Union law is higher in the hierarchy compared to national law. The second principle which makes European Union law so powerful is the principle of direct effect. Now, what does the principle of direct effect mean? Direct effect means that in order to be applicable in national law, Union law does not have to be enacted once again, but it is directly applicable. Once the regulation on the EU level has been enacted and once it has entered into force, it is automatically applicable in the national legal orders. It's not necessary for the member states to enact another law in order to accept this European regulation into national law, but European Union law enters automatically and by itself into the national legal orders, which is a rather stunning feature if you know the mechanisms of international law, where one concludes an international treaty and then has to ratify it and transpose it into the national legal order in order to make it applicable in the national legal order. Nothing of the kind in relation to European Union law. It is directly effective in the national legal order. Now, when we go back to European energy policy, we have to have a look at the place on the European energy market. First of all, we've got the consumers. Well, that's obvious. And then we've got energy companies, and here we've got a feature which is relevant for regulation. Usually, or at least in a quite a significant number of member states, the energy companies used to be vertically integrated energy companies. That means energy companies that were not only producing energy, but also supplying energy to the consumer, and were the proprietors and operators of the transmission systems, the transmission grids, and the distribution networks. So very powerful vertically integrated companies. However, that is not the case anymore, because in the process of creating a single energy market and in the process of regulating and designing a European energy market, the European Union has required energy companies to split up, to separate the production from the supply and the network branch in order to make them less powerful and to guarantee a better protection of competition on the energy market. In order to enforce all that, you have got the national regulatory authorities. Those are national institutions, national boards that have been created by European Union law. And these national regulatory authorities have the task of ensuring the functioning of the energy market according to the European principles in the respective member states. The national regulatory authorities are very powerful, independent authorities, and are not, well, let's say, are not to be influenced by the national legislator. That means they have to apply European law and they have to be guided by European law only. There are two more levels in the institutional field of energy regulation, and that is, first of all, the Agency for the Cooperation of Energy Regulators, which is more or less a forum where the national regulatory authorities meet and discuss things. There are a few decision-making powers of this agency, however, it's not a particularly powerful one. The one that is particularly powerful is the European Commission, which is the institution that is whose task it is to enforce European Union law in the member states in general and energy law in particular. So the European Commission is the one that will make the most important decisions apart from the European legislator concerning European energy regulation. When one goes to the core features of the European energy market and dealing with that comes to the questions of where European regulation is particularly important, one can find some, let's say, core decisions, some basic principles that I would like to present to you here very briefly. First of all, regulation in the energy market is about market liberalization. Market liberalization has been an objective of European energy policy for quite a long time, for nearly 30 years now, and it started off with the admission of new electricity suppliers to member states' market. Before that, we had very closed markets with captive customers that couldn't really decide which energy supply company they would like to choose, and that has been altered by European law by market liberalization. Then, in order to make the suppliers less powerful and less prone to exploit their dominant position on the market, the European Union has enacted legislation to unbundle the branches of supply, of generation and networks. There are different ways of unbundling. I don't want to go into detail here. They started off with accounting unbundling, organizational unbundling, legal unbundling, and went up until ownership unbundling, which is the most prominent form and the most severe interference with the principle or the right to property if you have to sell your network in order to be able to go on supplying and generating energy at all. The second part, or the second feature of regulation, is that once the liberalization for the customers was achieved or was being achieved, the Union created the so-called regulated third-party access to the electricity networks, which means that now everyone was entitled to use every network, irrespective of whether or not the owner of the grid was fine with that. That means that new energy supply companies could enter the market because the grid is an essential facility. You can't deliver electricity to the consumer without having a grid, and if the grid is owned by someone who does not accept you, who does not let you into his grid, then you have no chance of entering the market. And therefore the Union broke up this sort of monopoly or oligopoly of the network operators and created this regulated and compulsory third-party access to electricity networks. Obviously, in order to ensure the security of supply, it was necessary to have, on the one hand, a grid, a network that is working well, and someone who is responsible for the overall security and stability of the network, and that is the transmission system operator. There is a specific process of certification according to European Union law, but that is the person, that is the company that is responsible for the overall stability of the grid. And then you've got an independent national regulatory authorities that is enforcing both this responsibility of the transmission system operators to keep the grid stable and secure, but also to enforce the third-party access, to enforce the competition on the market. And that's the independent national regulatory authority I've already talked to you about briefly before. When one comes to the national regulatory authorities, one has to understand some specific features. First of all, their task. I told you already, their task is to design a functioning electricity market with competition, enforce the competition, design the market accordingly, break up monopolies, and ensure also the stability and reliability of the grids. It is also competent to ensure affordability. That means that consumer protection is another task of this national regulatory authority. So it's a very powerful overall authority, an authority that is basically the one that is applying European Union law directly and without any interference by the national government or the national legislator. In order to achieve that, it has to be truly independent. It has to be independent not only from market actors, so that it is obviously impossible that the national regulatory authority is in some sort of close connections with potential or actual market actors, but it has also have to keep a distance, a significant distance, to the national legislator and the national government, because the national government will not be able to guarantee competition on the energy market in the same way as an independent and competent national authority that is just applying European Union law is able to. If you want to understand the national regulatory authorities in more detail, I've printed some passages, some excerpts from the secondary legislation in creating these national regulatory authorities in the following pages. I don't want to read them out to you and to go into detail here because we haven't got the time. But those are the texts that basically require the member states to set up such national regulatory authorities with a high degree of independence. For those of you who are interested in going into more detail here, we've got a judgment of the European Court of Justice that is stating a very broad understanding, a very far-reaching understanding of the independence of the national regulatory authorities, but which, as it stands now, is the relevant leading case in this field, and therefore one has to accept it, even if one might have doubts about the judgment and its reasoning in general. I don't want to go into detail here because of, well, time reasons, but if you would like to have a look, it is online. It is quite easily available since you've got the case number. To sum everything up a little bit, I hope that you got a broad overview of what European energy policy is about. The main areas of conflict that we are dealing today are the general structures of energy supply system and the energy mix in the member states. That's what I highlighted when we were talking about Article 194, paragraph 2, subparagraph 2 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, which makes it more difficult for the European Union to enact laws that reach carbon neutrality by 2050, which makes it more difficult for the European Union to reach its climate goals and therefore to pursue its objective of climate protection in the energy sector. However, it is not impossible. So the European Union has enacted laws and has acted in other directions, or let's put it, has used other instruments, like, for example, incentivizing the member states, creating funds and regulating energy markets in a way that is not directly in conflict with the energy mix of the member states, but which is sort of nudging the member states into using more renewable energy, into having a better grip on energy efficiency and so on. The second area of conflict I would like to highlight is the integration of renewable energies in national and national support schemes, the integration of renewable energies into the energy market. In order to reach carbon neutrality and also in order to get a more secure and reliable energy supply system that is not dependent on fossil fuels anymore, one has to improve the integration of renewable energies, which are easily available, however not particularly reliable. And in order to increase this reliability, in order to increase the integration of renewable energies, member states have decided that it is necessary to set up support schemes, and some quite significant support schemes, because if you start off with renewable energies, or if you start off with increasing the output of renewable energies, you might often find yourself in a economically less favorable position than the producers of energy from fossil fuels, and therefore we've got national support schemes in order to outbalance this disadvantage. However, whenever the state interacts with the market and interacts with competition and sets up national support schemes, it is constantly inevitably distorting competition and interfering with the market. And therefore, one has to find a sort of balance between, on the one hand, the need to integrate renewable energies and the need to support the creation of new power plants on the one hand, and on the other hand, the functioning of the internal energy market, which is basically hostile to national support, hostile to state aid. Because if you are running a market on state aid, the market is not able to develop itself in an efficient manner. And the last area of conflict I would like to highlight here is grid extension and sustainability. A huge point in European energy policy is grid extension, is grid maintenance and grid extension, because in order to get a secure and reliable supply system, the grid, the network of the European energy system has to be extended significantly, and that's not only costly, that is also something which is well which is not very well liked by the population, and which can create a conflict with sustainability issues, with environmental protection issues. However, it is indispensable to build up the potential of the different grids in order to avoid that too many suppliers of renewable energy would like to feed into the existing grids, and that the existing grids cannot cope with the sheer amount of renewable energy that is being fed in. Therefore, grid extension is another huge issue in European energy law. It has to do something with regulation insofar as regulation can be used to make things more efficient. However, there is no way out of the need for a significant boost in infrastructure for the sake of a secure and future-oriented system of energy supply in the European Union. Last but not least, I've put here some reading, some sources for those of you who would like to get a more detailed insight into European energy law and policy and European energy regulation in particular. Thank you very much for your patience.